It's a really unfortunate and dangerous time for Black voters and voters of color, but it's also really just sort of the same thing that we've seen for a very long time in American history. And what the Voting Rights Act initially did was to prohibit broadly literacy tests, poll taxes, any of those very obvious restrictions that had made it more difficult for Black voters and other voters, Native Americans, Latinos, or white voters to vote. And that really opened the door to democracy for everyone. My parents both went to segregated schools. Both were the beneficiaries of litigation that LDF and others brought. I grew up in California at a time where there was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of issues around police brutality, protests, and responses to that, as well as crackdowns on people of color, immigrants of color, and trying to not just disenfranchise, but strip away the rights of American citizens. Really had an impact on me being aware of the impact that the law and policies can have on Black people and other people of color.
Hi, my name is Chris Kemmitt, and I'm here today with Deuel Ross. Deuel and I are the new co-directors of litigation at the Legal Defense Fund. Deuel is one of the leading voting rights attorneys in the country, so I am thrilled to be in conversation with him about the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, LDF's role in shaping that law over the past 6 decades, and his own experience as a civil rights attorney, including successfully arguing a pivotal voting rights case in front of the Supreme Court. Deuel, thank you for being here with me today.
I'm so glad to be in conversation with you, Chris.
All right, so to kick things off, Deuel, could you tell me, why did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 mark the true beginning of our multiracial democracy in America, particularly given that it trailed so long after the 14th and 15th Amendments?
Sure. The Voting Rights Act was really pivotal in changing American history and creating, really for the first time in America, not just a multiracial democracy, but a democracy, period. In the wake of the Civil War, we had the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were meant to give Black voters and other voters, people across the country, a real chance at citizenship and to be freed from historical discrimination. But unfortunately, states, particularly states in the South, passed a series of laws that made it much more difficult for Black voters and other voters of color to vote. Those laws were anything from literacy tests to poll taxes, to property requirements, to also gerrymandering. So, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there were districts that were majority Black or where Black voters could join with other voters and have an opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice. But states or counties would, or other local governments would make decisions about how to draw those districts that would essentially eliminate those majority minority districts or other districts that gave Black voters any kind of opportunity to elect the candidates of their choice. That went on for about 100 years. And only in the wake of civil rights activism, LDF's court wins in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, was that really paving the way for Black voters to have a voice and for Congress to respond in the wake of the Bloody Sunday in Selma to pass the Voting Rights Act. And that really opened the door to democracy for everyone, but again, particularly people in the South, making it easier for them to register to vote. The sort of two core pillars of the Voting Rights Act are Section 5, which before 2013 essentially required states with a history of discrimination to ask permission from the federal government before they pass any new potentially discriminatory voting law. So that could be something as small as where your polling place is located, being moved from one place to another, to something as big as how your congressional districts or state legislative districts are drawn. All of those things would require permission from the federal government before a state or a local jurisdiction could enact them. The other key provision of the Voting Rights Act was Section 2, which broadly prohibits racial discrimination in voting, and that applies nationwide to every state in the country, to every voter in the country should be free from racial discrimination in voting.
So what was the impact of the Voting Rights Act for Black voters, especially in southern states?
Sure, particularly in southern states, as I mentioned, it gave Black voters and really voters of all stripes an opportunity to register to vote in large numbers for the first time. In many of the southern states, in some southern counties and places, Black voters, 0 of them were registered. Even in states that were, or in counties that maybe were half Black, there would be zero registered voters or one or two. In statewide, many places there was Black voters were only registered at maybe 5, 10, 15% of Black voters were registered to vote. In the 5 to 10 years after the Voting Rights Act, those numbers doubled and tripled. And so Black voters, for the first time, were really having an opportunity to register to vote in large numbers. And the results of that registration was also the first time Black people were having an opportunity to elect members to city councils, to county commissions, to school boards, and even to Congress in some places in the South. And that really opened the door for people, Black voters and other voters, to really just have an opportunity for the first time in history, really, to have their voices heard at all levels of government and to have an opportunity to really influence policy in a direct and really important way.
What are some landmark Voting Rights Act cases that LDF has argued, and how have those cases affected voting rights today?
LDF has argued a number of landmark cases in front of the Supreme Court, everything from Shelby County versus Holder to Allen versus Milligan, Bolden v. Mobile, to Thornburg versus Jingles. All these cases have really laid the groundwork for either protecting voting rights or at least attempting to protect the voting rights of people of color and other people across the country. And so LDF has played a really pivotal role in protecting and defending the rights of Black voters.
So you mentioned the Shelby County decision and a little bit about the kind of legal change that wrought. For people who aren't familiar with it, could you explain a little bit more about how it's affected Black voters in the 12 years since it was handed down?
Sure. The Shelby County decision has had a really devastating impact on Black voters and their representation across the South. What Shelby County did was essentially turn the tide against Black voters. It used to be that if you were a voter in one of these covered jurisdictions, if there was any kind of potentially discriminatory voting change that a state passed, then the state could not implement that change before they asked either a three-judge court in Washington, D.C., or the United States Department of Justice for permission first. And they would essentially, they and the jurisdiction would have to prove that the potential change was non-discriminatory before it moved forward. Now the burden is on plaintiffs to go to court and try to stop these potentially discriminatory changes after the fact, after they happen. And so I think one really good example of why this can be burdensome for Black voters, even when they win, is what happened in two of LDF's recent cases. One was our Texas voter ID case. Texas immediately said that they were going to implement their photo voter ID law, even though it was very clear that that law had a discriminatory effect. That means despite 3 court rulings between 2012 and 2016 saying that Texas's law was discriminatory, Texas was able to use that law throughout that entire time because we didn't have that protection of Section 5, which would have put the law on hold pending any ruling on the merits about whether it was discriminatory or not. Something very similar happened even in the Milligan case that was in the Supreme Court in 2023. Even though the trial court found in January 2022 that Alabama's map that had passed was racially discriminatory, the Supreme Court basically put that ruling on hold, and that meant for the 2022 elections, Black voters were not able to elect their candidate of choice into congressional districts, and instead they had to wait until the Supreme Court issued a second ruling in 2023 before they could have the opportunity to elect their candidate of choice in 2024. So it's really been very difficult for Black voters to get the kind of relief that they would have been entitled to under Section 5, where any kind of discriminatory change was put on hold until a court could actually decide whether it was discriminatory or not.
So you just mentioned Allen versus Milligan, which you argued in 2022 in front of the United States Supreme Court. That case got to the heart of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits voting practices that discriminate on the basis of race. Your argument demonstrated that Alabama was trying to get away with racial vote dilution. Can you explain what racial vote dilution is and where we're still seeing it today?
Sure. What vote dilution is basically states and cities and county councils and school boards have the power to draw their state legislative districts. Unfortunately, for a very long time, states have used that power to draw districts that disenfranchise Black voters. So after the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, as I mentioned, Black voters, for the first time really in American history, had an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice and to actually have their votes counted in a way that in the past they were simply just barred from registering to vote at all. The result of that, unfortunately, though, was that states then started to draw districts or adopt electoral systems in which Black voters' votes would get drowned out by white majorities, or they would draw districts in such a way that even though naturally there might have been a majority minority district in a city or a county, the state would divide up that community in a way that prevented Black voters from actually having their voices heard.
So I'm going to ask you to toot your own horn a little bit for a minute. You and LDF ultimately won Allen versus Milligan. Why was that such a momentous victory for Black voters in Alabama and more broadly across the United States?
Really, it was a team effort, as all things are at LDF. And so I don't want to underestimate the importance of our clients and colleagues in doing all the incredible work that they did. But that win on behalf of Black voters that LDF and our clients were able to win has really been important, particularly in light of that long history of discrimination that I'm describing and the Supreme Court's unfortunate recent series of decisions, both in Shelby County, more recently in Brnovich, and the Supreme Court has substantially weakened the Voting Rights Act. And so the affirmance in Milligan of the framework of how to prove a violation of the Voting Rights Act, a framework that's existed in Supreme Court precedent for up to almost 50 years, and a reaffirmance of Congress's power to enact civil rights statutes like the Voting Rights Act that prevent racial discrimination, even if that discrimination is not intentional, was really monumental. The result of that has been that Black voters have seen other wins in places like Louisiana, Georgia, and across the country. But that doesn't mean that Black voters are sort of, that it's easy, right? These cases are very difficult. They're very time intensive. Black voters have continued to see defeats in other states because, or other voters of color because they haven't been able to prove these cases, or they haven't brought cases because these cases are really difficult to prove. So it's been really important to sort of maintain the existing tools that Black voters and other voters of colors have to protect their rights and to maintain the really important gains that we already have had in the last 60 years since the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
A 2022 Washington Post analysis found that more than 80% of the lawyers arguing before the Supreme Court in the prior 5 years were white, and only 2.3% were Black. What does it mean to have Black lawyers arguing the cases that are foundational to Black political power, and how can we get more Black lawyers before the court?
I think most of the Black lawyers who've argued in the Supreme Court in the last 10 years have been LDF lawyers arguing civil rights cases. And I think that's a reflection, fortunate reflection of the bar and of access generally in America to opportunities to go to college, to go to law school, to get opportunities of this sort. And so it is about the Supreme Court and access there and who's giving those opportunities and who gets a first opportunity and then a second one. But it's also, I think, more importantly, a reflection of America and the long way in which we have to go, in which Black people and other people of color continue to face obstacles that make it really difficult for them to get to the point where they're given the opportunity to give those present argument or litigate cases at the highest level.
Are there any key moments in your life that you can share that brought you to this kind of civil rights work?
Growing up as an African American, I've always obviously been very deeply aware of the obstacles that myself or members of my family have faced. My parents both went to segregated schools. Both were the beneficiaries of litigation that LDF and others brought in order for them for doors to be opened for them, whether it's from where they went to school ultimately or where they went to got jobs. And it's also been impacting my life from a very young age. I grew up in California at a time where there was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of issues around police brutality, protests, and responses to that, as well as crackdowns on people of color, immigrants of color, and trying to not just disenfranchise, but strip away the rights of American citizens. Really had an impact on me from a young age, growing up and seeing that in high school and even before that in elementary school, being aware of the impact that the law and policies can have on Black people and other people of color, and wanting to do my part to make sure that people actually are not subjected to that kind of discrimination.
Turning back more specifically to voting for a minute, what are the biggest threats to the rights of Black voters right now?
The federal and state governments threatening to eliminate things like early voting, mail-in voting, access to voter registration, and voting opportunities that have really expanded opportunities to vote for people of color, and then also states engaging in mid-census mid-decade redistricting. States are supposed to redistrict, usually do redistrict after each census, which happens every 10 years. The last census was in 2020. The data was released in 2021, and so states redistricted around that time. The fact that states are choosing to redistrict now in 2025 ahead of congressional elections has a real potential to dilute the votes of Black voters, and that can happen through states eliminating majority minority districts, or states choosing to try to benefit one party or another by moving Black voters into a district because they think that Black voters are going to maybe be supportive of a particular party. So it really is something that, regardless of the political party that controls the state that's making these choices about mid-census redistricting, has a real potential to disenfranchise Black voters and other voters of color and make it harder for them to elect candidates of their choice. It's a really unfortunate and dangerous time for Black voters and voters of color, but it's also really just sort of the same thing that we've seen for a very long time in American history, repeating itself over and over again in ways that are always slightly new, but also often look very much the same.
So most people are not civil rights lawyers. How can the average person advocate for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and more generally fight against voter discrimination?
Sure. The John Lewis Act is an attempt by Congress to fix some of the issues that have come up in the Supreme Court cases in the last 10 years. It would first create a new coverage formula to identify states with a recent history of discrimination that would be subjected to preclearance under Section 5, and then would also try to make it easier for voters to bring cases, particularly cases about changes to the time, place, and manner of voting in light of the Supreme Court's unfortunate decision in Brnovich. The act is really important, and so one thing that people across the country can do is call their members of Congress and ask them to support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill. It's a bipartisan bill, and so you should really be calling whoever your member of Congress is, you should be calling and advocating for the bill. You also can be advocating at the local level. So many states have been passing state voting rights bills or have been trying to pass state voting rights bills. And so if you live in a state that's where there is momentum to pass a state voting rights act, being supportive of that act is really important. And then also just getting involved locally, right? So if you're worried about how voting is changing at the state level or at the federal level, that's all really important. But it's also really important to get involved day to day. Your city council, your county commission, your school board, helping volunteering on those elections, whether it's to be a poll worker or a poll monitor, or just keeping people in your community updated about any potential changes to voter ID laws, polling places, are all really important ways in which you can get involved. Like I said, from advocating to Congress, advocating to your state senators, local legislators, to also just being there on the ground on election day and keeping people informed and in the loop, and helping them in whatever way you can.
Thanks so much, Deuel. This has been a really great and informative conversation, and I hope everybody's learned a lot. Thanks for everything you do to advance racial justice and for your time here today.
Thank you, Chris.